Well, good evening. Um, so today we are going to be looking at, so we're going to be looking at continuation that we had in part 9. Trying to get the computer to stop giving me feedback. Is the sound better? For those of you that are online, let me know. Um, so last week we went over the state, the role of the state within its respective sphere. And we talked about how it can move outside. Hey, Stephen, how you doing? How it can move outside uh, the roles that God has defined for it within that sphere, that domain that God has set up for the state. Um, when we understand that the state uh, governance, the form of government that God had set up was Him as being the top. Look at First Samuel when the people of Israel came to Samuel and said, "We want a king," and the yes, um, when the people of Israel came and said, "We want a king," and Samuel said, "I don't think this is a good idea." When he prayed about it, and God said, "Don't worry about it. They're rejecting me as their king. Go ahead and anoint somebody as their king." But prior to that, God was the head of that domain. He had set up judges, 12 judges. Some people only point to 11 because one judge was really, really bad. And they don't like looking at him, but that was he was an appointed judge. But during that time period, there was appointed 12 different judges to act as judges over Israel. Um, so we had that sphere of government, how God sets up government among his people. But then there's the other nations, the outside nations, the Gentile nations, and they had set up a totally different side of uh, governing principles, usually founded within a king um, or a queen. Later, when you start looking at Plato, when he started, or was it Plato or Aristotle? Plato, and his treatise on the Republic. Started talking about how do we get a governing body, a senate, if you will. You know, Athens and Rome were famous for bringing in senates or governing bodies, but Native American tribes had governing bodies as well. They there were some tribes that had chiefs, there were some that had governing bodies. Anyways, making a short story incredibly long. Um, we explored that last week in you know who actually sets up the laws of the state. How do we determine the right or wrong laws within that state, within that sphere? Today, we're actually going to take that, last week's tour, as Dr. Tackett says, tour number 9, the state, whose law are we referring to, or whose law is the governing law for our society. And we're going to now look at what is that with the Great American Experiment? How does that match our own history here in this country? Lots of really good stuff. Um, so I am going to turn it over to Dr. Tackett and get out of the way.
Hello.
Hello.
Well, good morning to you.
Good morning. Good morning.
Oh, thank you. Last time we were together, we were dealing with the issue of the state, and we looked at God's design for the state. What did it look like? What was in this sphere?
King.
God.
What else is in the sphere?
King.
King.
The king, and we could write civil magistrate, but that takes so long. King is a nice short word. The king must understand that he is subject to God, and if he begins to think that he's no longer subject to God, he soon becomes God himself in his own mind. And the king who thinks he's God soon becomes the devil. What else is in the picture?
Citizens.
The citizens. And we talked about this relationship. So today what we want to do is ponder the question, what should this agent look like? If Romans 13 says that he is the agent of God, God's servant, what should it look like? It began with Moses, then God raised up the judges, then it became this notion we call the king. God blessed the king David. What is the proper form? And I'm not sure that there is a single form, but the most important thing is whatever this agent is, whoever this agent is, that he must see himself in this relationship to God. I think that one of the best ways to answer that question, and it's what we're going to do today, is to turn our attention to an experiment that was done to try and form that agency. And we're going to look at the American experiment. Not because I'm an American, not because I just love this country, which I do, but because I am convinced that the people who founded this country, the people who came here, from the Pilgrims and the Puritans, they came with a comprehensive biblical worldview, a mature worldview. One of the passages that was referred to during this period was from Isaiah 33, verse 22. Let me read this to you. For the Lord is our judge. The Lord is our lawgiver. The Lord is our king. It is He who will save us. What are the three elements there?
Judge.
Lawgiver,
Lawgiver.
judge,
King.
king. And those are the three elements that they believed were the essential part of the civil magistrate. And that is why we have the three branches of government: the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. Well, the people who founded this country, were they perfect? No. They were sinful people, just like you and I are sinful people. When we examine the American experiment, we're going to try and separate as best we can the principles that they were trying to achieve. And I am convinced they tried to lay down biblical principles in the formation of the country. And we'll separate that from the character. Flawed, yes. America is an interesting country. And it's interesting because it is in vogue today to hate America. In fact, if you were to interview the students at our institute, you would find, and it may surprise you, that there is a deep hatred for America within liberal academia. Why is that? America is a country that people love to love, and it's a country that they love to hate. Be that as it may, we're going to turn our attention now to the American experiment to look at the question, what is the right form that this agency should take?
What is America?
I love America.
The land of the free and the home of the brave.
I've never been there.
America is a place where you can be yourself, you can challenge thought.
America is nothing more than boundaries set by somebody.
It's my home.
America is opportunity.
American culture is one that's really centered around individualism.
I get to be me in America.
It's not so much apple pie and cheeseburgers anymore.
My best mate who I live with, she hates Americans.
It's a country where liberal activity, people can say and do what they want.
The concept of America represents a beacon of hope in a dark world that's full of corruption and death. And
America is a country that has a lot of power. I think obviously the most power.
We are the #1 country.
So I think that means we have the most responsibility, helping everybody in the world.
those principles that it's founded on give other nations that don't have freedom can look to America and see that those freedoms are possible to have.
America's being free. That ain't no joke.
America is not all that is. I mean, we are one country in North America, and if you were to, be the astronaut looking back at this beautiful world, America is just one tiny piece.
I'm a patriot. I'm a former military officer who took an oath to defend this Constitution.
We try to take care of a lot of people and we try to intervene in everything just to see that this planet goes the way it should.
I think it's important for us to look for ways to interact in the global community such that we're bringing leadership that's creative and that's collaborative and that invites peace.
If we just sit around and be peaceful with everyone, eventually someone is going to strike us and our city on the hill is going to fall.
My father took an oath to defend this Constitution. My uncle, my son did. My father-in-law, most of my friends. It's a place we'll die to defend.
And without that city on the hill, the world, in my opinion, would be thrust into darkness because they would have no light standing upon that foundation of principles to show them that it was possible to stand in that same way.
Well, no matter how you view it, the reality is that something has happened in this country. And something is happening now in this country that breaks my heart, actually. We're going to look at the then and the now, and it's looking at the then and the now that probably breaks my heart more than anything. To see the difference between the hopes and the dreams and the foundations and the principles that were there and how we are turning away from those and the consequences of that. Well, okay. What was the second best-selling book in the American colonies? Now, the first and the best-selling book was the Bible. What was number 2?
Guinness Book of World Records?
Well, it's called the New England Primer. This was the book from which we taught Americans to read and write. You can consider it the first grade reading textbook. If you're a first grader in America, you learned to read and write probably from the New England Primer. An interesting book and an interesting window into what things were like. Let me open it up for you. We taught the children the alphabet, of course, but we taught them this way. A, in Adam's fall, we sinned all. B, heaven defined, the Bible mind. C, Christ crucified for sinners died. And then we taught them big words. When I was in first grade, I learned see Dick run, see Jane run, see Dick and Jane run and run. We taught them words like fornication, edification, gratification. And then we taught them lessons. A lesson for children: pray to God, love God, fear God, serve God, take not God's name in vain. Do not swear, do not steal, cheat not in your play, play not with bad boys. Call no ill names, use no ill words, tell no lies, hate lies, speak the truth, spend your time well, love your school, mind your book, strive to learn, be not a dunce. And then, questions. Who is the oldest man? Methuselah. Who is the strongest man? Samson. Who saves lost men? Jesus Christ. And then we taught them the catechisms, a series of questions and answers that help the students put together biblical truths in association with a question, and they would memorize them. So the teacher would call on Susie, little first grade Susie, stand up. Question 22, how did Christ, being the Son of God, become man? And little Susie would stand and say, Christ, the Son of God, became man by taking to himself a true body and a reasonable soul, being conceived by the power of the Holy Ghost in the womb of the Virgin Mary, and born of her, and yet without sin. Thank you, little first grade Susie. You may be seated. What do you suppose the NEA would say about this? Well, let's read. If the study of the Bible is to be excluded from all state schools, if the inculcation of the principles of Christianity is to have no place in the daily program, if the worship of God is to form no part of the general exercises of these public elementary schools, then the good of the state would be better served by restoring all schools to church control. Oh, I forgot to tell you, that was 1892. They were beginning to see a change already. A little bit of a warning. Not too many years after that, we saw then the rise of John Dewey, who is considered the architect of modern education. His worldview is a little different. Faith in the prayer-hearing God is an unproved and outmoded faith. There is no God and there is no soul. Hence, there are no needs for the props of traditional religion. With dogma and creed excluded, then immutable truth is also dead and buried. There is no room for fixed natural law or moral absolutes. Are we surprised that the majority of our students today do not believe in absolute truth? Let's think about the founding of some of our universities. Let's begin with Harvard. Some of you may not know it was the first university founded in America and was founded by the Puritans. Look at the first rules and precepts of Harvard. Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well. The main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life we've looked at. And therefore lay Christ at the bottom as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning. The original precepts for Harvard. What about its original motto? Its original motto was truth for Christ and the church. That has now been truncated to simply veritas, truth. And I'm not sure they know what that means. Well, let's look at Princeton. What was its founding statement? Cursed is all learning that is contrary to the cross of Christ. What about Columbia University, one of the most liberal universities in our country today? Look at the seal that is still there. Above her head, written in Hebrew, Yahweh. At the top, from Psalm 36:10, written in Latin, in thy light we see light. On the ribbon, Psalm 27:1, God is my light, written in Hebrew. Under her feet, the reference to 1 Peter 2:1 and 2. When you begin to look at the founders and their statements concerning this area of education, we begin to see something very interesting. Gouverneur Morris, now you may not know who he is, but he was one of the most prominent speakers during the Constitutional Convention. He was the chairman of the Committee of Style, so we actually wrote the U.S. Constitution. He said, religion is the only solid basis of good morals. Therefore, education should teach the precepts of religion and the duties of man toward God. So there was no politician who would disagree with the wide use of the New England primer. Let's look at others. Samuel Adams, the governor of Massachusetts, considered one to be one of the greatest founders of this country, said, "Let divines and philosophers, statesmen and patriots unite their endeavors to renovate the age by impressing the minds of men with the importance of educating their little boys and girls, of inculcating in the minds of youth the fear and love of the deity, in short, of leading them in the study and practice of the exalted virtues of the Christian system." Another, Benjamin Rush. We'll talk about him in a minute. "In contemplating the political institutions of the United States, I lament that we waste so much time and money in punishing crimes and take so little pains to prevent them. We profess to be Republicans, and yet we neglect the only means of establishing and perpetuating our Republican forms of government. That is, the universal education of our youth in the principles of Christianity by the means of the Bible." Benjamin Rush was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. How did they attempt to try and perpetuate that? If you look at what is called the Northwest Ordinance, there is an article that was written in this ordinance. This was the ordinance that laid down the requirements for a territory. If it wanted to become a state, it must meet these ordinances. Look at Article 3. "Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged." That meant that if you wanted to become a state in this union, you must have schools, and those schools must teach religion, morality, and of course, knowledge. Noah Webster, one of my favorite founders, and I'll talk about him a little bit later, added his perspective. "In my view," he said, "the Christian religion is the most important and one of the first things in which all children under a free government ought to be instructed. No truth is more evident to my mind than that the Christian religion must be the basis of any government intended to secure the rights and privileges of a free people." Interesting statement. How are we going to reconcile these kind of statements, the reality of what our educational system was in the beginning? And quite frankly, you could look at virtually all of the first universities in this country, and you would see the same kind of founding things. How do we reconcile that with what I was taught? And that is that, no, America was founded as a secular country. Well, something happened to me, and in order to explain that to you, I have to kind of walk you through the journey that I went through. Several years ago, I did have the privilege of being called to serve the president at the White House. And I'm ashamed to tell you that when I went there, I was a fairly naive individual. But my naivety was not in my area of expertise. My naivety was in America 101. In understanding what these fundamental principles were, what these pillars were. I don't know how often I rushed through the Capitol and rushed through Washington and was oblivious to the memorial stones that were there. Probably the most prominent are the murals that line the rotunda of the Capitol. If you've been there, you will recall how wonderfully done those murals are. The very first one is the arrival of Christopher Columbus. That history has suffered greatly at the hands of historical revisionism. Christopher believed that providentially he'd been given the name Christopher, which means one who bears Christ. His purpose for coming here has been rewritten. Why? Next to that is another mural, the baptism of Pocahontas. And if you've seen the Disney production of Pocahontas, you too will recognize, maybe you won't recognize, there's a great deal of historical revisionism within it. Next to that, this beautiful painting of the pilgrims as they're on the deck of the Speedwell before their initial departure. The scriptures open, their eyes and hands held open, eyes uplifted to heaven in prayer. that history too has been rewritten, as we saw in our tour on history. Something